So hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to Before You Build a Capital Campaign, How to Plan Objectives for Board Approval. We're happy to have you joining us today and appreciate you taking time from your busy schedules. My name is Kimberly. I'm part of the QGIve team. And if you haven't had the opportunity to work with us before, we're an online fundraising platform dedicated to helping nonprofits raise more money. And how we do that is through webinars like this one. Today's webinar will be about 45 minutes with a Q&A session that follows, so bringing our total time together to just about an hour. We will be recording the presentation and sending each of you a follow-up email with a copy of the recording link, presentation, as well as all the other resources that we do mention today. So please be on your lookout in your email for tomorrow afternoon. That should be coming your way. If you do have questions throughout, at any point during the presentation, please go ahead and pop them into the questions box. Our presenters are ready to answer and discuss those during our Q&A portion that follows. For all of you tweeters, we are live tweeting highlights of today's webinar, so hashtag QGiveWebinar, and our username is QGive. And then after today's webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey. So your feedback is so crucial to us in determining future content for webinars and other resources. So we encourage you to definitely look for that. We value our relationships here at QGive with our friends, with our partners, and we love to connect the two. So we are proud to connect our partner network with Paul J. Strawhecker, Inc., and everyone out there. Paul J. Strawhecker is a consulting firm dedicated to helping nonprofits with strategies, communication, and resource development. Many of you are familiar with QGive, but just thank you for those that work with us. For those that aren't as familiar, we do offer a suite of powerful online fundraising tools for everything from donation forms, event registration, text, peer-to-peer fundraising, auctions, you name it. And together with our partners, we enjoy helping nonprofits like you make smart and strategic digital marketing decisions. Today, as I mentioned, we have two speakers actually. We have Paul and we have Ryan, and as you'll see and hear from them, they are subject matter experts, and I think everyone's looking forward to seeing how they can help. So without any further ado, over to you, Ryan and Patrick.
Okay, thanks, Kimberly. So yeah, we're really happy to be here. Thanks for having us. We appreciate QGive giving us this opportunity. So what you see here today is similar to the summary that we put in front of this presentation. We've got four major goals for today. The first is to kind of talk about and hear about a project from the construction planning perspective, and overall what your board needs to know before you take the next step in that project or move forward. So this is really a holistic view of the capital project, as most nonprofits know it. It's not just the fundraising side, but the whole thing. And at this point, I'd like to just say, we talked about questions, but a lot of this is scenario based. So as we're going through this, please think of any kind of past, present, future ideas or scenarios you might have. We'd love to comment on those and talk to you about them. The second one is, some common pitfalls. Budgeting can be really difficult in these projects. So we really want to talk about how to make sure that process goes smoothly. We're going to talk about feasibility studies. There's two major ones that Ryan and I are familiar with. There's kind of your project feasibility and fundraising feasibility. We'll get into those differences later. And then, general kind of what conversations do you need to have? What information needs to be ready before you start talking seriously with your board about a specific capital project. So starting with the first goal of early project planning. So this one you really cannot start soon, like too soon. Basically, the minute you get an idea from a board member or an executive director, or you get a new program that you think is going to need a new home and new space, and you're going to need to have a capital expansion, that's when you should really engage in some conversations with other professionals in that field of construction to kind of get some more ideas. It's not always about speed, so you don't have to go super fast, even though some people feel that way. It's more about sequencing. So getting good advice at the beginning is very important. There's no such thing as over preparing. So I always say due diligence is your friend. Don't feel like this step of early project planning is too slow, because the time spent in this stage is really great and it's very valuable. Your goal with some of these this preparing at this point is to kind of answer questions before they can be asked. So that comes into play later on when we're talking about what to present to a board. Is that's kind of our mindset throughout this, is what's the board going to ask, what are funders going to ask, and how do we uncover the solutions or answers to those questions. You also want to kind of go through the different forks in the road. So again, every project is different, and it's kind of scenario based, but really try and do a thought process of what are the big decisions, what are the big twists and turns that this project may take, and variables that are that accompany the project. Keep your circle as small as possible. So this is really about, I talked about getting in with someone that has done these types of projects before, had a different take on it. But you want to do that, in my opinion, before you get too far down the road with architects, contractors, engineers. Lots of boards are going to have individuals on it that have those connections, and they're going to want to bring them in as early as possible because they think they can add value, and they probably can. The only challenge with that is, when you bring in people from the actual construction development world, they have incentives to kind of keep the project moving and what that initial vision is. And what we're really trying to do here is understand the scope before we make any of those big decisions on where we want to go with the project. So again, that keeps the scope where you want it to be, not and what's best for your organization. And then really we want to dig into what kind of capacity your team or organization has. So sometimes, it's good to have kind of a two-phase board approval. What I mean by that is, an initial kind of concept of what we're thinking, and then you get kind of an approval of, should we dig into this more? What other information should we know before we go down that path completely? That's fairly common, or I guess more advantageous for smaller organizations that are going to be really, I guess, more tied to limited resources. So you really want to make sure it's a good investment to go down that road. A lot of times the initial feasibility and information gathering phase can sometimes be funded by the funders that are tied to the organization. So that's an option too, when you kind of have the phased approach. And the actual cost, that final bullet, is really thinking about, internally, what staff would do what when you're looking at this entire project, how involved would we want to be, what's that going to take if your staff is going to be involved, what's going to take away from them, what are they going to not have time for? And so that's what I mean by actual cost, is what's it going to cost the organization when you shift resources like that, and really think through that, not just the financial budget, but the human capital budget as well. Okay, so now for budgeting. Again, early estimates from architects and general contractors, it's good to have them in for concept, but if they are digging into like the budget or giving you estimates, those can be fairly inaccurate sometimes, and they're never gonna consider everything. Moving on to the second bullet there, they're not thinking about all the things that go into the budget that's for the whole nonprofit, right? So, it's easy to kind of estimate by square footage or other means depending on what materials they're going to use, but that's really not taking into effect, or I guess narrowing in on specific costs for furniture, tech, signage, all those things you see listed. The reserves and the operating funds are very important as well, which we can kind of expand on a little bit. And the budget, it's important to get it as close to I guess a reasonable range this early stage as you can, because what we've seen a lot of, Ryan and I, as we've worked with clients, especially smaller, like $1 to $2 million projects, is they're kind of under the understanding that 80% of that is going to be the construction, and that percentage goes down and the total budget kind of goes up. So, what they think is around $1 million project is probably 1.2, 1.4 million when you're considering all these different aspects of it, and making sure that the organization is going to move into the space and utilize it immediately. That's a big consideration when we're talking about, what kind of finances and resources you should have in place before you kind of go down the path any further. And the quality and appropriateness can suffer. So again, if you don't have good scope early on, then you may not get everything you want out of the project, or it might not be the exact space, and then you're kind of dealing with how do we make it work for us later on. This is also a really great stage, even though your leadership is probably handling the actual numbers on the budget process. This is the best place, or one of the nice places, to get feedback from your staff, depending on how big that is. You can extend it to maybe just another level of leadership, or maybe the entire organization, depending on how large you are. And that will allow you to kind of tie costs to those elements. So again, the budget should tie back to all these things you're wanting to do, not just how much we estimate this is going to cost. It should have kind of a strong connection to those aspects you want to see in the space. And yeah, that kind of ties into what donors are going to think and questions they're going to ask. Donors, yes, they are very passionate about the missions. They've got their focuses. Personal donors or individual donors and foundations kind of know where they like to fund things, but they are also, just as much looking for good, value for their dollars. They want to make sure that they have peace of mind, that they can trust what you're presenting them, so they don't have to kind of worry about where this is going to go. So the more solid our presentation is to them with numbers, especially, the better. And on that line, no matter how well we tell the story of what the organization is trying to do or services, if the numbers don't line up with it, or there's some sort of disconnect, then that's sometimes a red flag for donors and foundations. So we want to be cognizant of that. Okay, some budgeting pitfalls. So some of these were listed on the previous slide as far as like what we should be thinking about, but here's some more specifics. A lot of times there's more costs associated with getting new land or property. The studies and the due diligence pieces, like environmental studies and looking for mold and asbestos and all those things can kind of stack up, I guess, over a period of time if you're not sure what you're getting into. So this is when it's good to kind of lean on your real estate broker, your commercial broker, if you're using one. Again, also with the next bullet, getting accurate upkeep costs, that's kind of tied together, but your broker should really be able to help you understand what are all the costs for getting into the space or owning the space for that very first step of acquiring and developing a property. And also what are some general costs we need to consider in our budget to maintain this after we renovate it or build this building on this land. And then do exercises with fellow leaders to kind of walk through the space. That's what I always like to try and do is, we've got maybe some sort of rendering or some kind of concept in our minds of what's going to be in there. And so, even if it's walking through your current space that maybe does some of that programming, like what do you wish you had in that current space? Kind of just going through a conceptual process of figuring that out. And as you go through this, it's, don't be afraid at any time in the process, really, is my philosophy, but don't ever be afraid of asking basic questions. So again, a lot of organizations that are doing this, it's the only time they may do it in 10 or 20 years. A lot of executive directors, it may be the only time they do it in their career, or most commonly the only time they may do it with that organization. So, there's a steep learning curve when it comes to real estate development. So don't feel afraid to pause the conversation at any point and ask what something is. Just like anything else, there's tons of acronyms, tons of jargon. So don't be afraid to kind of take a time out and ask more about it. And the byproduct of that is also an advantage, because if you're working with folks that are kind of that are reluctant to pause with you and kind of walk you through it, then that can be a red flag that maybe you don't have the best people on your team. So if you're working with an architect or a contractor early on that's wants to kind of move quickly and isn't willing to kind of work at your pace, then that's something you may want to revisit or talk about internally. And if you can't include, this is one of the biggest elements of budgets that are left out for a lot of nonprofits that we see, is what's the space going to be used for and how are you going to fund it? It's more square footage usually if it's a new building or renovation. And so the considerations of exactly how much cost will go into that new space over a 3 to 5 year period can sometimes be short-sighted. So again, we really want to think about what new staff we're adding, what's the space going to be used for, what materials are we going to need to do this new program in this space, and make sure we have all that accounted for. Quick note on that is a lot of funders and foundations, especially where we are starting to kind of almost require that, at least in the criteria when they evaluate different nonprofits, is if they don't see kind of that reasoning of how are you going to fund this once the building's done or the space is renovated, it's kind of concerning for them a little bit, because then they're kind of thinking, well, how much have you thought through? So again, this is where taking a lot of time on planning and making sure you've got all those questions answered is really important. And don't forget about revenue. That's one thing I always try and preach to the clients we work with is, you know, think creatively about ways that we can balance out this budget. Most people think that the budget for a project like this is they go straight to the expenses, which is obviously the bigger piece to figure out at this point in time. But we should be understanding or thinking about how we can match revenues to those expenses with the new space we have. So is it a contract with a local foundation, you know, government system, government entity that's kind of giving us funds to do this work? What could be the new revenue streams that would be at our disposal if we can get this new space? And that is a big thing with funders too, is understanding how are you counterbalancing these expenses. And if you've shown that you've kind of done some legwork on that side to reduce the amount that needs to be fundraised, it usually goes a long way. So that's a lot of information. Again, I'm excited to get to questions if anybody has any, but you know, trying to figure all that out that we just went through kind of gets us to this next goal, which is understanding what can be done in feasibility studies. And there's two major feasibility studies that Ryan and I have worked with and are familiar with. One is the project side, which I've kind of gone through, you know, figuring out exactly what the feasibility is of doing this project. Taking the time to do a feasibility for the project is really great because, again, you may not have the resources, or you may not be exactly ready to move forward with whatever it is you're exploring, and that's okay. So it gives a nice little spot for people to kind of breathe, for the organization to kind of sit on it and think about it before they kind of hit the gas pedal and start moving forward with one of those scenarios. And sometimes it's good to delay, sometimes it's good to rescale. You know, obviously there's external factors that come into play. We all know that after 2020. So it's kind of, you can be more flexible if you understand the scope, you understand what is going to kind of happen with that. So that's kind of the project study. They do overlap some, which is kind of understanding, you know, what our resources are, what's possible. You know, Ryan will get into more of the fundraising here in a second, but it does give you a good understanding of what you and your organization are ready for. And that's really important before you take this on. They do work well together, but they do have some overlap, and they can both help you in different ways. So I've kind of already talked through the project one. I'll hand it over to Ryan to get more into the fundraising feasibility.
Hi, everyone, and good to be in front of you and be part of the presentation and share some experiences with you. So Patrick spent a good amount of time partly on budgeting, and that is so important because our presentation today is about what your board may want to know before approving a campaign, which we really are going to get to at the end of this project in detail, and presentation in detail, sorry. And so the budget is so important because the budget does set everything up to your scale. And the feasibility study is partly about scale and partly about, you know, what you can raise and what other funds you have coming in that maybe aren't from the philanthropic community. So I just have a couple comments to start, and those have to go with our experience of kind of working with funders and having conversations about campaigns. You know, it's one thing to have somebody come to you with a potential project and have a lot of the detail for how the project will work, and also the reasons why the project is needed. You know, as development professionals, we're usually pretty good at being able to explain how great our organization will be and how many people we can help after a project is finished. The second part of that, though, is, well, how are you actually funding the project, and is your project making financial sense? And so the Venn diagram and what Patrick's been talking about, we're looking for that sweet spot between the two. So thank you, Patrick. So on the feasibility study, our company calls these philanthropic planning study because we're talking about studying if the philanthropic community is going to support your project and at what level. So you're looking for some donor input and buy-in. Usually a feasibility study or a philanthropic planning study includes interviewing of donors, interviewing of high-end donors, your best donors, maybe having some conversations with foundations, things like that. You're trying to get a feel for if the money is there and at what level it is there for your potential project. And we're bringing all this up because there is a level that you're going to want to have done some of this before your board approves a campaign. The last thing a board of directors wants is to approve a big project that your organization hasn't done one, let's say, in several years, and you're not successful, right? So board members are much more comfortable if you are approving something where you've already done some good chunk of legwork, you've talked to potential donors. Oftentimes it helps to have a consultant or someone from the outside helping to weigh in on the successful path forward. So that's a lot of what the philanthropic planning study is for. You're also going to produce a little bit of a plan for early commitments, because in a study, you're usually walking away, at least if you're using consultants, with a report that has some themes of what they've been learning from the philanthropic community and their answers and ideas about your project, and also some range of what they think can be raised. And I also want to make a point here too that if you're new to campaigns, it's important to understand most campaigns aren't just funded by the philanthropic community. So usually an organization is going to come into it with maybe some early gifts have already been made. Maybe there's endowment money that they've been saving to do the project. Maybe there's a federal grant that's come in, but your philanthropic dollars are hopefully not 100% of what you're trying to do a campaign project with. This next section is something I really wanted to provide as a learning for everyone, because we do get the chance as a consulting company to talk to donors, and over the years you get different concerns about campaigns. And I want to mention these because as you are talking to your board or thinking about your own organization, it's easy to say, hey, we need a new building or we need more space, let's go do it and make it happen. But I want you to understand what some of the funder concerns might be. And so you want to prepare for these answers. So funders may ask, is this a community need? Is this just something your organization wants? And so part of that question is being able to explain that this isn't just 3 people that work at the organization that want this project to happen. The whole community or the constituents, the people that need the program, want this to happen. And that's something that donors want to know and understand. Secondly, is this organization have a clear plan? Are they coming at this just from a, hey, we need to do this, or are they already thought through everything that Patrick has kind of walked us through in terms of the logistics of their project? And I have had folks ask before this question, which I think is interesting. Who is backing this project? And that's kind of a loaded question. So maybe what they're asking there is not only, hey, is your board behind it? Are there board members that are making financial gifts and behind your project? But they may also be getting to, is there other community leaders that are already said yes and or sort of representing this, championing your campaign? And so it's interesting that people want to know that, but that does impact how people think about your campaigns. Do they have financial stakeholders contributing from the get-go? This is kind of a cash flow question, but it's similar. And a study does help you there because you've gone out and you've talked to several people, and therefore you kind of know if there's people interested in making gifts early on. And then we have talked about this already, but it is so important, and that's the scope. So does the plan and the scope seem to be changing? And the reason that's going to be a potential problem for funders is perhaps they talk to you and it sounds like your project is a $3 million project, and later they talk to you and it's a $7 million project. So you want to, they want to understand that the scope is fitting what is needed for the organization. Hey, we're not overbuilding, but we're definitely looking to the future, et cetera. And so there's a lot of questions around scope, and that's part of what will usually take several months to figure out for an organization. What's the size we can do? What's the size of range we can raise? Patrick mentioned this, but the sustainability is a good question. Usually that's handled through an endowment fund or through some people that will contribute later on for ongoing, expenses, but it also could be handled because the program or changing your campaign is going to add increased fee for service. And so maybe what you're doing with your campaign is creating more income for you, and therefore that helps your sustainability plan. This slide is nice because this comes from Kent Dove, and Kent Dove is, I believe, a retired professional, but he had wrote a couple books, and one of them really hits on keys that we should be thinking about for studies. And again, in the feasibility study, philanthropic study, he's talking about some bullet points here, what you should be trying to achieve and walk away. Again, important because you're hoping that you've done these kinds of things before the board has approved your campaign. So you want some support and time commitments from key groups. Ken is saying here, have the board members, the CEO, and some volunteer leaders and donors committed to this project before you are kind of going public and moving much farther forward. Having a clear image, has the organization done strategic plan? Does it know exactly where they're going? Because a campaign begs the question of what is your vision for the future and what direction is your organization going in? Objectives based on important and legitimate institutional plans. Same thing, budgets, needs, the organization has their act together in their direction that they're going in. Is there a compelling case? So usually we use the word or term case for support in a campaign, and sometimes that's a written document, usually it is. But certainly something that explains why you're doing what you're doing, what the vision is, what the costs are, and what the benefits are. So a lot of the donors for campaign are expecting that type of document. A market study could be several different, feasibility studies. It could be searching the geothermal land. There's all sorts of things that can be market studies, but again, it's about preparedness and understanding pitfalls that could happen in the future. And then have they done some leadership and gotten leadership enlisted, which we've sort of already talked about. Are the major donors for this organization then also going to contribute? Oftentimes, you'll have an organization that is somewhat small and they're trying to use a campaign to grow or double in size. Well, maybe they don't have very many major donors above $5,000, et cetera. So that does beg a question, are there donors in the community that are going to really come out and support this organization and they're trying to grow? Next two slides I'm going to go through fairly quickly because we've covered some of these, but this gets into some detail on a feasibility study philanthropically. Usually that's a 2 to 3 or 4 month process where you're going out and you're interviewing people, as we've talked about. Well, what it does, though, is it does prepare your board of directors for the process ahead. And it's doing that by providing themes from those that they've done the interviews by and setting sort of a bar for what can be raised. Usually in a study, you're going to walk away and the study will recommend, say, $2 to $4 million campaign, or maybe more specifically, $3.5 million campaign. So the board's going to feel good that that money can be raised after this study process. It does help you enthuse and identify a volunteer base because people are being asked if they would be volunteers. It also helps clarify and hone the project components. When you do interviews, people give you feedback and people give you good feedback and they brainstorm with you. And so they might say, I love component A of your campaign, but I really think component B should be much bigger, or that you could do something different with component C. And oftentimes you hear people brainstorm with you about people, have you talked to so-and-so? Have you talked to this business who is doing something, similar to what you're proposing? So there's a lot of ideas that happen in the study phase that can help change and benefit your components of your project. We talked about the case for support. You also will be developing a gift chart and some of your preliminary gift asks, so you can walk away kind of getting a feel for who out there you might be asking at what level for different types of gifts for this project. And lastly, you're establishing that range of money that you can raise. This is a similar slide, but I think one of the bullets on here, near the bottom on grant writing is important. Perhaps depending on the timing of all this work that you're doing, your board is going to approve the campaign. And once that's kind of approved, you might be able to start writing grants depending on how solid your project is, meaning the project logistics that Patrick covered. If all your project logistics are fairly there and you know your budget, etc., you're ready to perhaps write grants right away. So you should be coming out of the campaign with a little bit of a grant writing plan, knowing when some deadlines are, etc., so that you know what we're doing. And I did skip over it. I didn't mean to, but second bullet was refining and defining project messaging. And that's just another point on, as you've heard from interviews and donors, and now you've had a couple of 2-3 months to be working through this project with several people and several leaders. So messaging really starts to occur. Hey, here's how we should be talking about it. Here's some things that really aren't resonating. We need to message more about X, Y, and Z. So this time at the beginning, before your board approval, helps you really pull all this together.
Okay, so I'm going to read through these, or I guess kind of start with them, and Ryan can jump in as needed, or if there's something I miss. But so this is kind of capturing what we want the considerations of the board to be prior to approval, which is kind of the meat of this. So again, some of the key big concepts here are things we've already covered, but just to kind of put it in a summary, you've got the agreement on the scope and scale. That's a common theme you see throughout this. Like what's the range of scale we could have on a certain project? You know, what if we go big, what does it look like? If we just try and get exactly what we need, what does it look like? So the questions that donors will have on that, or board members, is really important to make sure we can answer all those.
Yeah, and I would, add, of course, your board's going to have some level of conversation of that. But I think also what's important to think through is how much your board, or at least the leaders that are involved in the campaign, because maybe there's a steering committee, which is a couple people on the board, et cetera, that are involved in these discussions. But how much are they willing to go up and down, and what are the ifs and whys that they would go down? So you may agree that you're doing a $3 million project, but if XYZ federal grant comes in, maybe you're able to do something more, et cetera. So it's a little bit of getting everyone on the same page on what are the things that are going to shape the highs and lows of what you can do.
Mm-hmm. And then Ryan touched on this, but is it something that how do we explain it's something that the community does need? I think there's a couple pieces to that. One is how do we understand the need as we see it and tie our goals to that for the project? And then also, is it unique? I think that's one thing sometimes groups miss is, it may sound like a great idea and there's a population we need to serve, but how do we know that someone out there isn't already doing it in our community? So we want to be able to be sure to answer that question as well. A lot of board members are on different boards, so they may be familiar with something similar. And so we want to know that before we have the conversation so that we are prepared and can talk to it. The community impact, or the value, that kind of ties to the previous bullet. What's the need, and then how are we going to deliver on, getting it, trying to solve that need, or how are we going to pursue a better situation around that need? And then, the whole impact of the organization. So, Ryan touched on this earlier with early donors that are maybe quiet before things kind of get rolling. Cash flow is huge on these projects. The budget, is one thing, but then when you talk about timing of cash, that's another. When you get to the, let's say it's approved and you get down the road with, design and construction, that's when dollars really start being spent in the budget, the major expenses. So you do want to make sure that as you get pledges or gifts, that it lines up when they're going to give the cash, lines up with those next steps. That's something you really do want to think through at this point, or at least have a concept of before you talk to the board, so they know. That's a big question a lot of board members have, is how are we going to pay for this as it moves along. And then the preliminary budget, we've talked about that quite a bit, but a full understanding of all those line items, how we arrived at those line items. If it's an estimate, why did we choose, the kind of logic behind that estimate? A lot of board members have really good financial backgrounds. They're going to have really detailed questions usually about how we arrived at certain numbers, so it's good to know that. Yeah, go ahead.
Just, I mean, something to add on that is just, I think as professionals that have done fundraising, we're kind of used to the concept and experience that different donors are different and they ask for different things. And so, again, the budget part is just so important because you can really get excited about a project as a potential funder and love what the organization is saying on what they're doing and why they're doing it and the direction they're going in. And so then the second thing that happens is they get that budget and see what that project costs. And so, is there excitement for the project going to go up or down when they get that budget? And it's kind of the example of, hey, in my mind, this project you've been talking to me about might have been $3 million, but then you told me it was $40 million. And so, the budget is going to beg questions from funders, and the more money someone gives out, probably the more they care and look at these budgets, because they've probably experienced a lot of projects that thought they could do something at whatever level and it didn't come true. And so they are going to dig into some of the details of the budget.
Mm-hmm. And I neglected to mention this earlier, but there's really like two different, I think, kind of steps with the budget. There's this early one where, again, we know some of these numbers are really rough, but we're estimating as best we can, and we want to make sure conceptually in whatever cost range it makes sense to the board, and then eventually donors we've already talked to in the philanthropic planning study. And then the next big phase is kind of down the road, but it's refining that budget to being almost exactly what it should be as you go through some of the design process. So if it does get approved, then there's a whole other kind of, I guess, timeline for when it should be final, and then we don't touch it anymore. In between those 2 points, you could have lots of different iterations as you're learning more, but I know we're not touching those future phases, but that's something to think about. Okay, and then timeline and schedule. So, this is always something that's going to have a lot of questions around it. When are we doing this? Does it match with what our need is time-wise? Again, if this space is needed for a new program or service that's being funded already, but we need space for it, how can we make the timeline work so that we have the space when those funds start to come in? And then, the leadership structure, Ryan's very familiar with this, is once we get into the, understanding how we're going to raise this money and who's going to do what when it comes to the board or leadership of the organization, it's really important to kind of have thoughts on that before you address the board with it. How are we going to play to people's strengths and seeing things like that to put them in a good position for success?
Yeah, I think an important point on this last bullet is obviously every organization is different and every board is different. But a campaign lasts a long time usually. So you're talking about several months, you're talking about maybe a year, some longer. And so the question is, who is the person that is going to be driving this as it takes this time to get it completed? And so if you're trying to sort of go down the path of doing a campaign and you don't have board members committed to it, or you don't have a steering committee or smaller portion of the board just dedicated to it, right, you can certainly run into a problem where 4 months down the road, when maybe there's a little less momentum for a month or two, board members starting losing interest or something. So, the point is that you want to know your campaign leadership from the get-go. You want to know that there's committed people that want to see this project through and are going to stick with it. And so these are these conversations that you're having as you're approving the campaign. Who amongst us is helping make sure this gets done right? And so I know you've had some points also, Patrick, on how organizations kind of structure that leadership team.
Yeah, and even like extension of that is who is going to be the maybe point person for the organization. A lot of times, logically, people just assume it would be the executive director, but depending on the size of your organization, it may not be the top leader. It may be someone else on the leadership team, another director or something like that has maybe a background in this type of work that reports. But again, that's back to the internal resources. You really want to understand how you're using all your resources that are at your disposal, and that includes the board and community stakeholders. So, okay.
Well, this slide is also about the board and what they should be thinking about as approving, but this is more about what gives some confidence and engagement to the board of directors in this stage. And so, you know, if a board is confident that the money can be raised, certainly that helps them kind of give the green light to go forward with the campaign. If they can understand that the impact that this project has on the organization and the people it serves are going to be worth the cost, then they're going to want to move forward with the campaign. And if people believe that the organization is positioned well to take the project on. So, you know, you do always run into this question of, is this the right project for the right nonprofit at the right time? That's sort of a somewhat common phrase. And so the belief that this is the organization that is best suited to take this project on at the right time is a question that your board is probably considering when they're approving a campaign. So there's an expectation of you know, that you have good board and steering committee participation. Again, there's a lot of red flags and things that can happen if you don't. And you're wanting some commitments from the board, probably financially for your campaign, and there's kind of a time to do that. And so you're also then, next bullet, you know, confidence in the endowment and sustainability plan. So your board, maybe they are on board with what the project is. Second question should be, well, what happens when the project gets done? And so if there's confidence that once this project is done and we're in this other place with either a building or programs, et cetera, they have confidence that they can sustain our new organization at this higher level, because we're assuming there's additional costs annually to the organization. That confidence is there, you know, that will give them more confidence to make the green light. Yeah. And then they feel like they can promote to the community and funders easily. This is a great question. You know, maybe your board members like what we're doing and they like the project. If they feel uncomfortable talking it to others that they know, other business leaders, other philanthropists, that tells you something though, doesn't it? You know, so you want board members that are saying, I would love to take this project to people I know and talk about it. And so you want to get them to a place where they understand the project enough that they're able to kind of say that and be excited about it themselves.
I want to add one more thing. I know we're close to taking questions here, but the way I think of all these bullet points is, you know, it's really hard to get definitive yeses to all these questions, right? To where we have the board in this exact position, they feel good about all these. You know, that's really difficult to do, but as many as we can. So like as much confidence as we can build and as much concern as we can alleviate, the better. And that's kind of the mindset when we're going through this, is how many of these can we have the board feel confident about, or how we can have stakeholders or donors feel confident about these, the much better position we're in as we move along. So, okay, here's our contact info. I know the slides are going to be sent out, so everybody will have those. And then we can get to questions. So, oops.
All right. Thank you so much. Gosh, Patrick, Ryan, that's a lot of great information, a lot of things to think about. Definitely. So for everyone, if you do have any questions, we have a few minutes. Please go ahead and put them into the Q&A. But we do have a couple here that were pre-submitted for some folks that weren't able to dial in today. So how, and both of you, either of you, how does the size of an organization, say small organization with about 4 non-program staff members versus a large organization, make a difference in decision making for a capital campaign?
Well, I think I kind of see it as 2 different tiers in my mind. I mean, there's probably a lot in between. And it depends on the organization, the number of people, but there's kind of like a 0 to 50 range of folks that you have in an organization. That can be split up in lots of different ways, but some of the core things you're going to need, not just for planning, but to actually execute on a project like this internally, you know, you're going to need, again, we talked about having some sort of internal stakeholder that can really, you know, lead the charge. You know, anybody who, you know, finance team or accountant that's helping with this budget to make sure the numbers are sound and things like that. So that the smaller the organization, that 0 to 50, they probably don't have all those pieces, right? And so you're gonna have to figure out who's gonna help with that. Is it, you know, like an owner's rep group that helps kind of manage the project? You know, here at Paul J. Strawhecker, we can handle the marketing and the fundraising and things like that if you don't have a big development team. I think when you get above 40, 50 employees in a nonprofit, larger ones, they usually have folks that are in those positions. So then it's how do we support what they're already doing. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of how I think about it. It's like, what are the two different sizes? And we try and accentuate those two different sizes in different ways because they have different capacity.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and the organization size question, kind of goes back to that roles, which Patrick alluded to. Are there people in your organization that have a natural role to help do the campaign, or are you going to need outside help, or even is there an assistant that is available to just help schedule things and help coordinate? So those are all questions. And the smaller the organization, the less of that they're likely to have.
Great. I know someone, it looks like, raised their hand. If you're still, if we haven't answered your question, if you could please put that into the Q&A, that would be helpful. We do have a couple other questions here in the meantime. How do you know if you can do a capital campaign without a feasibility study?
Yeah, so that's always an interesting question. And I think there is a point, sometimes it's just in the amount of money raised. So a lot of organizations are going to have every couple of years a project at $200,000-$300,000 or something like that. So they may not want to do a feasibility study because they know, well, there's a couple of donors we can go to and have a good start. And so, as you're below $500,000, you're probably not looking at a feasibility study generally. However, everyone is kind of making that decision on their own. And obviously, there's a lot of folks that do go and do a campaign without a feasibility study. There are projects that we've gotten pulled into that we hadn't done the study for. And, 100% of the time, you wish that you had. So at least from our experience, we're far better off having talked to donors in the beginning and getting a feeling for the scope and how much they might give in the beginning. Because generally what does happen over time with campaigns is there's a tug and pull that, hey, we've got this idea to add to the project and maybe the cost could go up, or construction costs have gone up, et cetera. And if you haven't done that campaign, it's hard to know if you're outpricing your campaign in a way. And so that's feasibility study really makes a difference there, and it also brings in the volunteers you need at the beginning.
Can I add to that real quick?
Oh, please.
So I think we're really passionate about this because we've seen a lot of projects that don't have the right information in place. It's very difficult to help them catch up if there's not a study or a good uncovering process of what they're going to need and if they can get it. So that's why we try and speak to this as much as we can, and this is a great forum for that. Is the more we can educate nonprofits, leaders, to that it's okay to get someone involved early. You don't have to have all the answers. It makes the next steps much easier and everything kind of flows much better. If not, then there's kind of a natural pause where we have to kind of uncover some things and make sure that we're ready for this before we move forward, or before we feel like we can help them in the right way. So.
Gotcha. A couple other questions that are here. We have, how many times can a project budget change in a capital campaign?
Yeah, I tried to touch on this earlier. There's two main points of where I don't think it can change that much. You want to have a good preliminary budget that you can talk to gather interest, right? Until you have a rock solid one later that you will not change, that is going to go to donors in forms of applications and grants and things like that. In between those two, or even before that first one, I would say as many iterations as you need. Like I've done some projects, and before we even get to construction, before we lock in that final budget, where we've done 50 iterations, where you're just constantly fine tuning those little line items. We found a new vendor here that could do it for the project, our technology or something. And you just keep fine tuning so that you have the best budget. And that, if you can spend the time, or you have someone helping you do that, it makes the fundraising gain momentum even better in my experience, because you can show them some of the major, breaks you've gotten on the budget or reductions you've been able to kind of pull off. If you have a good architect, maybe they can redesign something as you learn more about it to save, $50,000, $100,000 on a major element. So the more you can kind of start high, it's kind of like the old under promise and over deliver. You start high, you give yourself a lot of space to kind of show that you can make it more beneficial or a more attractive budget. So all those iterations in between should be kind of doing that. But the number is however many it takes, I guess, to make sure that you get the right one in the end.
All right. And it looks like this is the last question I have, unless any new ones come in. How many volunteers are really needed in a campaign? Can't the leadership usually do all the work?
They can.
Yeah.
It's not always fun for them.
Yeah. I guess in our experience, you're using the volunteers to help get out in the community and make asks generally. So, when you do a study, you ask people to volunteer, and maybe there's a large amount of people that would love to help, fill envelopes and find some, kind of general volunteer, anything to help type things. But really what you want out of volunteers is the people that might help open doors with potential donors, probably at $5,000 and up. And so you're looking for connectors in the community and that kind of thing. And you probably want a good, 10 to 20 volunteers, depending on the size of your project, of course. But you definitely want a solid, probably 5 really volunteers on a committee that are kind of a steering committee that are really behind the project and are going to stick with it. And then you can bring in other volunteers as you need, in terms of PR or, PR and marketing or other skills that they might have and volunteer for. So when it's all on the staff members, it's easy for things to, just to be overwhelming. And hey, they also have this full-time job to do on the side. So figuring out those roles is part of the answer for how many volunteers you need.
And I feel like there's a lot of studies that have come to this conclusion, but when you're just talking in a basic form of like, we're trying to create a team that's going to be successful, trying to figure out how each person is engaged with it, and sometimes that's different. The more you can drive engagement, the better for the finished product. So, I think in my experience, I've seen a lot of leaders in nonprofits maybe be reluctant to ask some of the I guess the more connected people that are, in the orbit of the organization that maybe contribute in some way. They feel like they might be putting them out because they know their time is valuable, but it doesn't hurt to ask. I haven't really seen anybody, even if they're in a very demanding position in the community, be put off by it. So it doesn't hurt to ask. And if they say yes, then great. You have somebody who's really connected in the community, engaged on this thing, and it kind of snowballs from there as far as engagement's concerned, in my experience.
Yeah.
Well, gotcha. Well, I think that concludes our questions for the moment, unless anyone has any last minute ones. So I'd like to again thank you, Ryan and Patrick, for joining us today and sharing all of this great information. Hopefully everyone out there has found it helpful. Reminder, we will be emailing you a recording of today, as well as the links to the presentations and some other resources. And I believe Ryan and Patrick are also going to provide us a link to a special offer for everyone who registered today. So if you would like to hear from either one of the teams, QGIV or the Paul J. Strawhecker Inc., the contact information is in the deck and here on the last slide. So please take note. As you're logging off, please don't forget to complete our survey. And we hope that everything we covered today will help you understand more on the things to engage your board with capital campaigns. So thank you again, and we will be in touch. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.